So, I just beat Cuphead a few days ago, and wow. I did not expect that game to be anywhere near as good as it was. I thought it'd be okay, maybe pretty good at best, but holy shit, that game was incredible. Now, granted, the year isn't over yet, but at this point, I honestly would be pretty surprised if anything else came out that I would put above Cuphead for my Game of the Year this year. And this has been 2017, one of the best years we've had in gaming ever. And to say that about this game is just, it blows my mind how much better this game is than I thought it would have been. Okay, put it like this. Previously, before I had played Cuphead, my Game of the Year was looking like it was going to be Hollow Knight. Now, Hollow Knight is great. There are a plethora of reasons why it's great, but the main thing that sticks out in my mind when I think back on my time with the game is the Mantis Lords fight. Now, the Mantis Lords fight, if you don't know, is a fight where you originally start off fighting just one of the titular Mantis Lords, wherein you have to duck and dodge their attacks, learn their various timings, and get your hits in while you can, while repeatedly dying to them again and again and again. And then, just when you think you've won, halfway through the fight, two more Mantis Lords come in and you have to deal with both of them at the same time now. So, very Dark Souls, very Gargoyles. That fight, by the time I was finished with it, my heart was pumping like crazy, and I realized as soon as I beat them that I'd been holding in my breath for like the last minute of the fight as I finally exhaled in a sigh of relief. It was the best feeling ever. That put me right back in my days of originally experiencing Dark Souls, and was the fight that would go on to inspire the video I made called How Hollow Knight Captured the Magic of Dark Souls. So that one fight is what I love most about Hollow Knight. And that was just one fight that lasted like maybe an hour with a bunch of repeated deaths, and that's of a 20-hour game in total, 20 hours that I spent with the game. Cuphead gave me that experience every 20 fucking minutes. So, yeah, Cuphead wins. Holy shit. The boss fights in this game are amazing. Okay, now, I already spent an entire other separate video just going over each thing the game has in like an itemized list and being like, this is amazing, this is amazing, this is amazing. So, I'm not going to do that again here, although I very easily could and I would love to, but the game isn't perfect. I do want to point that out here. So with this video, I want to make it sort of a counterpart, the antithesis to the previous video filled with gushy love, and bring up some of the criticisms of the game that I do have, and that stop it possibly from being one of my all-time favorite games. So, the one thing that everyone seems to be generally agreed upon that's bad in Cuphead is the run and gun segments, but honestly, I kinda got used to them after a while and sort of found joy even in that section of the game. Like, when people criticize the run and gun segments in Cuphead, they're generally brought up as a sort of, okay, it's bad in comparison to the rest of the game, which is amazing. Like, the rest of the game is so amazing that it makes these segments, which by themselves would just sort of be mediocre, look bad by comparison, right? And I do sort of think that's true. I do think the game isn't particularly suited to being a run and gun platformer, but it works okay, and the main thing I found that sort of rearranged my opinion of it was when someone told me to stop playing the run and gun segments like I was playing a boss fight in Cuphead, and play it more like I was playing a level of Donkey Kong Country. That was really the sort of turning point, in my opinion, with the run and gun segments, is that previously I had been treating them like just another boss fight, whereas when I went in with a different perspective and expecting it to be a different sort of thing, I was able to appreciate them for their own merits. Now, one thing I will criticize about them is that I do not like how they are the only way to earn money in the game. There is a bit of hidden cash in the overworld, which you can go find walkthroughs online to go track down all the loose change here and there, but I do wish you could get some currency, even just like 1 or 2 coins from each boss fight, just so you didn't have to play the run and gun segments. Because while I was able to eventually find love for them, I do agree that they don't particularly mesh well with everything else the game has going on. So the fact that all the upgrades in the game, some of which I would argue are completely necessary to make the bosses not unfair are locked behind these run and gun segments that are technically optional but not really. That's a bit of a thing I don't like. I could do without that, is the point. Now, I brought up in the last video I did about Cuphead that I was skeptical of the multiplayer aspect, and I have since played some. I brought my friend around and I played like 2 hours of that, got past like the first island and a half or so of the game. And I can confirm that it is simultaneously too easy, but also paradoxically way more difficult. Now, it's too easy in that there are 2 of you, and of course the boss's health bar has been increased to match that, but you can constantly revive your friend, and generally the boss's attacks can only aim at 1 person at a time, because they were very obviously designed with a single-player campaign in mind. So, more often than not, the boss's red energy ball will be chasing your friend, and you can just sort of stand there and pluck away at them provided you're in a good position. So, I don't like that, and I also don't like how you can continuously resurrect your friends. Now, granted, the ghosts do get harder and harder to catch, because with each resurrection, the ghost flies up to the top of the screen faster and faster. However, it is still hypothetically possible to resurrect your friend time and time and time again, and that does subtract from the difficulty of the boss fights immensely. Now, as an example, when I went through the game a second time with my friend, and granted, I did know what I was doing, he did not, but I did, and I do know that makes the game easier in some respects. I breezed through the first island in, I want to say, an hour, and that's compared to my original run of the first island, which probably took me like 3 or 4 hours. Like, I did spend a considerable amount of time in that first zone, so the fact that I could just blow through it after that does, I think, show that multiplayer is way too easy. Now, contrast that with multiplayer being way too hard, not because of any gameplay restrictions per se, but just because of all the shit that's happening on the screen at once, which is hard enough to deal with in single player sometimes, is just compounded on by the fact that there's a second person also firing a bunch of different bullets and shit. It can be really difficult to figure out where you are in that game, to see what's going on, to know where the boss's attacks are coming from, or even just to realize what character is you. Like, even in my limited amount of time playing in the multiplayer, I continuously thought I was the other guy, and my friend continuously thought that he was me. It can get really frustrating like that. So, personally, I view the game as a single-player only experience, despite the fact the multiplayer was rather heavily touted as a feature. Just ignore it exists altogether, you'll prefer the game more that way. Now, thankfully, that multiplayer aspect can just be disregarded, but there are some problems with the game that aren't so easily brushed off. For example, a reoccurring issue I had with a couple specific boss fights was foreground or background elements interfering with me playing the game and fighting the boss. Now, there are a couple different examples I could point to in that regard, like threatening Zeppelin and whatnot, but honestly, I think the worst offender of this is that one fucking flying horse as part of the Mr. King Dice boss fight. Like, there is so much shit in the foreground of that fight that it is impossible to see where you're going. Now, there is so much of it in that fight that I'm tempted to think its inclusion was purposeful, like it was meant to be part of the challenge, but no, that's a really shitty way to add challenge to a game like this. Do not make the graphics fight against you like that. That sucks and isn't fun. Now, the last thing I have on my list of nitpicks before we get to the big final one is that parrying was, I think, just a bit too difficult. Like, I never saw the point for most of the game, because if you have 3 hearts and you see a pink bullet coming towards you, you could try to parry it for just that little bit of extra card increase to build up your super meter, but you're also risking like 1/3 of your health when you do that, so I never saw that as being worth it. And the parrying was just a bit too finicky to pull off for me to ever get the hang of. So, granted, that is fixed by the Pea Sugar edition. You know, the game has ways around that, and obviously that comes down to me just sucking at the game, not a fault of the game. Although I would maybe have preferred the devs to be a bit more lenient with the timing on the parries. So, let's get to the part of the game that I really didn't like. The final boss fight with the devil. Now, the first problem with this boss fight comes the second you enter into the 4th world. So, you enter through the casino gate and see the casino in all its glory. You go inside, and who is there to greet you but Mr. King Dice, who, by the way, is probably the best boss fight in the game. I fucking loved fighting Mr. King Dice. It blew my mind that his boss fight was essentially 9 mini-bosses all stacked together, culminating in one final test of survival and endurance. That was so badass! And seeing all the different bosses and all the creative casino gambling themed bosses you get to fight, oh, that was so great! That was the highlight of the game for me. But disregarding that for the time being, when you walk into the casino in the overworld, you go inside, and the casino is the main centerpiece, but that's for the Mr. King Dice fight. And the devil, mind you, the bringer of darkness, the fallen angel, the black-hearted one, the ultimate ruler of all evil, where is he at? Oh yeah, he's in the little side room off to the side. He's renting a room from the casino, I guess. Like, no, fuck that shit. He's the devil. He should be like at the bottom of a Stygian pit, or in like a gigantic black obsidian castle, or something that's not like a side room of a bigger building. That's boring as shit. So, minor quibble, very, very, very minor quibble, but representative of my actual overall opinion, in that I think Mr. King Dice heavily overshadows the final devil boss fight. And that's apparent even in just this little art design, where Mr. King Dice has this gigantic building all to himself, and the devil's sort of an afterthought tacked on. So, like I said, Mr. King Dice's boss fight was great. Fucking amazing. One of the best boss fights I've ever played in gaming. I loved it. So after that, despite the fact the devil was like in a shed out back, I was like, okay, I'm still hyped to fight the fucking devil, right? I'm excited I'm gonna go kick his furry ass and send him back down to hell where he belongs, right? And indeed, the first stage of the devil's fight was great. It was incredibly challenging. I died probably like 10 or 15 times just on the first stage alone before I finally got to stage 2, which was great. The devil's animated fantastically. I love the way like he morphs and shapes. I love all the animations and the way they like sort of stylize the devil in that fight. The entire like first phase of that fight is great. But then I got to phase 2, and then I got to phase 3, and then I got to phase 4, without dying. Now, to make it clear, I died a bunch of times on the first phase, but on my first run, where I survived long enough to get to the second phase, I had 2 health left, and I tanked through phases 2, 3, and 4, essentially on my first try. Now, that was incredibly disappointing. Like, after the King Dice fight, which probably took me like 30 or 40 separate attempts, like a ridiculous number of attempts on his fucking King Dice fight, he was so difficult, he kicked my ass 12 ways to Sunday. To fight the devil after that, and yeah, his first phase was good, but then to get to the second phase and not die to that at all, and to get to the third phase and to not die to that at all, and then to beat him on my first try on the fourth phase, it's just like, wow, that's kind of sad. Like, for a game that's kicked my ass so much up to this point, and I'd sort of built this final boss fight up in my mind as being the ultimate test of all the skills I've learned so far. And like I said, the first phase was good, but then you get to the second, third, and fourth phase, and he's an absolute walkover joke of a boss fight. And like, wow, I was really ridiculously disappointed by that. It was so good up to that point, though. Like, okay, I'm not discounting the game for having, like, the devil as a bad final boss fight. Like, if in my mind I just delete the devil from my memory and say that Mr. King Dice was the final boss fight, maybe you say that, you know, Mr. King Dice never existed at all. I just, you know, in my mind, paste the devil over Mr. King Dice's sprite and pretend that King Dice's fight was the fight with the devil. I would say the game would be great. It would probably be one of my all-time favorites, but the fact that that wasn't the case, the fact that Mr. King Dice was a character and was a separate boss fight from the alleged final boss fight, and that the final boss fight was so ridiculously weak in comparison, just wow, I was so disappointed by that. And here's the thing, I was talking earlier about how Cuphead might have been one of my all-time favorite games, and there was a very easy way to make that happen. Well, okay, two very easy things to do to make that happen. First of all, make the devil not a fucking pushover. Add, like, you know, give the devil like 7 phases. Like, go fucking all out with him. Like, he's the devil. He can be as hard as you want him to be. Make him ridiculous, right? So, first of all, do that. But second of all, I think Cuphead is the kind of game that's absolutely crying out for a secret hidden boss fight at the end. Like, if you go play through the game a second time and get, like, S ranks on all the bosses on expert mode, I think Cuphead's the kind of game that's crying out for a secret hidden final boss fight that just kicks everyone's ass and is the most badass thing in the universe. You know, like the Sands of Cuphead, right? If the game had had that, if the game had had a decent final boss fight in the devil, and had had like some secret extra final boss at the end, I feel pretty confident in saying I would probably have rated Cuphead in like my top 10 favorite games of all time. That's how much I enjoyed the rest of it. But for a game that was so good up to that point, to so utterly fail to stick its landing, just, oh man, and that's the thing, right? Like, I played through all the game, and I got to the ending, and the ending is probably what's gonna stick out the most in my mind. Like, when I think back on Cuphead, my memories will probably inevitably be tainted by the fact that the devil was the final boss fight, that Mr. King Dice wasn't the final boss fight. That's gonna taint my memories of the game, unfortunately. And if they just put in a little bit more effort, I mean, okay, the game's already amazing. The game, it already took 20 billion years to come out, but I mean, okay, cut one of the running guns and maybe cut Sally's stage play, which is also kind of a shitty boss fight, and use that to beef up the devil, and then to make like the secret final amazing, you know, this isn't even my final form version of the devil to fight once you've got S ranks on all the stages. That would be one of my all-time favorite games, I think. But the fact that it came so close to being one of those and failed so hard at the end, it's just, oh, I'm so disappointed by it. I really am. Now, that said, I do still think it's going to be my game of the year, just because, like I said, I did have a ridiculous amount of fun. I loved pretty much every single second of the game. Just, there are a few things that do unfortunately hold it back from being that masterpiece that I wanted, and that's a real shame. Special thanks to my wonderful Patreon patrons, including Jada Prague, Calvin Ryman, Ludwig, Isaiah Christo, Mythnut, Soul, Renataja, Taubob, Sawsbucky, Forgotten Paladin, Princess Scotch Tape, and Joe Anderson.